Hi, everyone. I don't know everyone yet, sorry, but we will get to know each other later, I hope. So welcome all to 15x4 Munich to our special chit-chat session. I will tell you in a bit what it is. I hope some of you already know what the 15x4 Munich is, but for those who don't really know yet, I will give a short intro. And first of all, we are knowledge sharing organization. So we share knowledge for people and by people, and we do it already since 2017. So for over 3 years now. That's really hard to imagine in a way because still feels pretty exciting, and even still I'm a bit nervous whenever we have an event. And here I would also love to invite you to turn on your camera so that we can see each other. It's not that only you see speaker and moderator, who is me, but that we see each other. So I'm Viktoria. I am 15x4 Munich coordinator, and I'm also involved very much with speakers preparation. And yay, I see more faces. That's great. And I've been with 15x4 Munich for quite a long time now. And I'm very proud of our team that we managed to find a new way to do events in these difficult times when we cannot do what we are usually doing. So our offline events, we really, really miss them. I guess you also miss them. For those who are in Munich, I have a surprise to tell you later. But today we're here online, and I hope we still can manage to have this nice interaction that we usually have at our offline events. We are also streaming on Facebook and YouTube. So if you know that there are some friends or family who would be interested to watch us, maybe they're not necessarily ready to join on Zoom, but who would like to watch us, please share the links. You can go to our Zoom page or to our YouTube, see the live streams there already live, and please share. And hi, everyone who is watching on the live streams. If you guys are watching us on the live stream, but actually want to join on Zoom, Yevgeny will now post the link on the chat so that you can follow and just join us here and be here with us face to face. Later on, ask questions with your voice, like a real meeting. And I think this will be exciting if we are more people in the Zoom call. So 15x4 Munich, as I already told you, is for about 6 years here. And during this time, we have organized more than 35, to be exact. This is the 37th event. So we had over 120 speakers, and in total, more than 3,500 guests came to our events. The name 15x4 comes from the format. So our classical format is to have 4 talks with 15 minutes each talk. And this gives us always a space to have many different topics combined, to have a chance to discuss many scientific and technology related topics. Today, however, we are doing something very different, very special, because we have but we have one great speaker today for you with one interesting topic. She will only get 15 minutes to talk, but then we will have much more time for all of the questions. So today we have Elena. She's a PhD student at the Max Planck Institute of Psychiatry here in Munich. And she is researching something which is very related to the topic of today's talk that she's presenting. And if you're curious afterwards, we can ask her to tell us a bit more about her PhD research. And the topic she will be talking right now about is sex differences in the brain. And without further ado, I just want to give this stage to Elena. So I stop sharing my screen and invite Elena to share hers.
And now I see Victoria. More faces. And this is the right one. So you should be able to see the slides now, hopefully.
Yes.
And
yes.
Thank you for the introduction. As Victoria mentioned, this is tightly connected to what my PhD is about. So I'm happy also to answer questions more on what I'm really doing every day in my research. But I'm going to start with these 15 minutes to give more a broad overview of what this field of sex differences in the brain really means. And I'm going to start starting from, let's say, an observation that if I put you in front of a woman and a man and I ask to kind of list what differences there are between them, the answer I would expect to actually get are answers such as the reproductive organs that are, of course, different, and maybe the secondary sex characteristics, such as having a breast or not. And maybe somebody would even mention that the hormonal system between the two sexes is different. However, we have been studying sex differences, especially in the last few years, and we have been discovering that this is not all. And there is much more different from a biological point of view between the two sexes in other organs and other systems that we didn't think before. And especially the organs or the system I'm focusing on for these 15 minutes is the brain. And one of the first of this observation that the brain might be sexually dimorphic, meaning different between the sexes, came from easy observation in the clinics. When we look at the disorders in the brains that we can categorize in the following types of disorders that you can see here, such as mental disorder, neurodegenerative disorder, epileptic disorders, brain tumors, immune-related disorders, and neurodevelopmental disorders, we can study how these pathologies develop and present in the population. And interesting, when we look at the number of patients affected that are either males or females, we can realize that there are differences according to the pathology we are looking at between the two sexes. And if I take mental disorder as an example, we can see that ADHD or autism is way more frequent in male patients, whereas anxiety or depression is way more frequent in females. And we can identify several brain disorders that show similar patterns that are either more frequent in females or more frequent in males. And following up on the example of mental disorder, and more specifically depression, as mentioned, we can see that almost roughly the patients are in a ratio 1:2 between women and men, where women are double, almost as double probable to be affected by depression. But this is not the only clinical difference we can identify between the sexes. And even maybe more interesting is when we look into how the pathology manifests, it's not only in the terms of number of patients, but even in the symptoms that patients develop that seems to be somehow connected to the sex of the patients, where females have a higher chance to develop passive symptoms and males have a higher chance to develop active symptoms. And this is an important point to point out, as being aware of these differences and being able to recognize them is very important in order to be able to diagnose the pathology appropriately in both sexes. But this is not all, and several other differences can be identified in the disorders, including their ability of the patients to respond to drugs and treatments. Here on the slide, you can see two main drugs that are used to treat depression. And as you can see, the efficiency that is represented in the numbers on the y-axis depends on the sex of the patient treated. So this is another very important point that highlights how being aware and studying more these sex differences will allow to improve the way we treat these disorders. So let's take a step back and trying to ask the question of how to go on this topic. So what we are really trying to understand is what's the difference between these patients? Why is one more prone to one type of symptoms and one more to the other? Well, the difference is that one is a male and one is a female. So the real biological question here is what's different between men and women, and in particular at the level of the brain, which is the organ that is affected in these brain disorders. So in order to understand the difference between men and women brain, we need to understand what really being a man or a woman implies for the brain. And the first implication that comes with being a woman or a man is that the genes, as the DNA in your brain cells and any other cells in your body, will carry different information. You might know that the DNA inside the cells is organized in chromosomes. And if you are a woman, we have an XX type of chromosome. And if you are a man, you have an XY chromosome. This means that the information within each of the brain cells is slightly different if you're a man or you're a woman. And this is important, especially for the brain, because these chromosomes are responsible for the production of the so-called sex hormones. those hormones that are connected to sex, and they are started to be produced in utero while the baby develops. And these hormones, in particularly the male one, is very well known to impact on the brain. And the male one that is called testosterone is actually known to activate a process that is called brain masculinization, or turning the brain in a more male-like fashion. So sex hormones impact during development on the brain itself, but this is not all, because sex hormones keep to be present also in the adult life. And sex hormones in adult life regulate the reproductive cycle of a person, but this is they keep also acting at the level of the brain cells as they do during development. So the main two hormones, the testosterone for the males and the estrogens for the females, are known to regulate brain cells activity in a very potent way. This might be the most obvious way you can think of how sex impacts on the brain, as a very tightly biologically enriched. However, the brain is also a very, very plastic organ, meaning that the brain is able to absorb a lot of information from the environment and change itself in order to adapt. And this is all has to do with the fact that you are able then to adapt also your behavior. So that means that the brain itself is very susceptible to be changed by experiences. And being a woman or a man changes the type of experiences you go through your life, because being a man or a woman changes the way you relate with the environment, meaning the society and other individuals, and how other individuals actually relate to you. So we categorize this type of experiences as sex-dependent experiences that are known to shape the brain itself. And finally, among the type of experiences that a person goes through, in human, we also have to mention gender, as gender is the self-perception of his own sexuality that shapes the way you behave and the way other people behave to you. Therefore, this needs to be taken in consideration among the experiences that shape the brain itself. So this overall is what really means for you to being a woman or a man, or better than for you, for your brain. So we can look then, and we can I can walk you through the fact that indeed this part of the sex does change your brain. But to do so, I would like to first walk you through the brain itself and the ways we can look at the brain. The brain is a very complex organ that works with a coordination of several structures that are kind of the building blocks of function of the brain itself. So when we look at sex differences, or in general, when we look at the brain, we can start from the small resolution, looking at these regions, and then move into a higher resolution levels, because these brain regions that have their own structure and volumes are actually interconnected to each other. And these connections are very important because allows these brain regions to activate themselves and the others in precise patterns. And we know, going deeper a little bit into resolution, is that this activity comes by the fact that the cells that compose the brain are particular cells that are able themselves to be activated. So we can look at the brain also at the level of the cells that compose each of these regions, because we have different cell types that interact with each other, leading them to activity. And finally, we can look at the brain also at the level of molecules, as these brain cells work because they have a setup of molecules that lead to final output. So when we start looking at the brain with the sex differences in mind, asking, is there really something different coming up from all these biological concept of sex? We realize that indeed sex does shape the brain. And the first level on which we can see these changes is a level of structure and volume. When we compare the brain of males and females, we indeed see that some regions, not all of them, but some regions are dependent on the sex of the individual. So here depicted in green, you indeed can see the regions that are being shown to be bigger in females. And these include some of the regions that, for example, coordinates speech and memory. Whereas in blue, you can see the regions that have been shown to be bigger in males, usually deeper regions in the brain. And the fact that these regions are different, the fact that these regions are different is not the only observation we can make. But the recent studies have also shown that the two sexes are different even at the level of connection. So, for example, taking this example, what have been shown through many studies and analysis of them is that male regions are generally more connected within the same hemisphere, here represented in blue. So regions between the same hemisphere are more connected to each other, whereas females, in comparison to males, are more connected across hemispheres. We, of course, as we structure M volumes, we are still trying to understand what these really mean. But for example, we know that when you connect regions across hemisphere, within one hemisphere, you generally are able to achieve an efficient action coordination, whereas across hemisphere is generally thought of a more efficient information integration. And interestingly enough, when women and men are tested in specific tests, men are usually better at spatial processing and are better motor speed, which requires better action coordination, where females are generally better at attention, word face, memory, and recognition, social recognition, which in turn generally requires integration of information. So we don't really know if these things are directly connected, but this is the first step to really understand if these brain changes in morphology are also responsible for some of those differences in behavior that we know exist between the sexes. Differences are not limited to connection, but even at the other levels, we can identify differences in the brain. For example, we can look at the activation of the brain of humans under scanning, and I could talk about many of them, but going back to the first example about depression, one of the regions that has been shown to be differently activated between women and men is the amygdala. The amygdala is a small region in the deep part of the brain, which is known to be associated which is one of the center for emotional processing. And interestingly enough, amygdala has been shown to be more sensitive for activation to negative emotion in females when compared to males. Again, we don't really know what this means and what are the results of this difference. But current studies are trying to understand if this higher susceptibility of females' amygdala is somehow connected to the fact that females are also more susceptible to stress and later on to depression. Finally, when we dived in more at a very small resolution, what we can see is also several regions of the brain show different cellular composition, meaning that when we look at the specific cell types, we identify a different ratio between cell types within the males and the females that is generally region specific. And finally, very recent studies also shown that when you even look at the same region or at the same cell type, you can still identify differences at the level of molecules that are inside these cells, suggesting that these cells, even if they are the same, might be behaving slightly different. So just to summarize, what we are finding out right now with all these studies that are upcoming is that the brain of males and females indeed seems to be way more different than we thought before. If these differences are region specific, we might think that these differences at several levels might be connected to each other. But importantly, these differences, however, range between individuals. And because it range between individuals and it ranges between regions, the current theory and the current way we are understanding the sex differences in the brain is that not the case that we have a male brain and a female brain, but more that we have a female brain mosaic, where a mosaicism between the different region and the pattern of extent that our region is a female-like and our region is male-like manifests in each individual. And generally in females, you have more female-like patterns, and in males you have more male-like patterns. Generally, we are able to tell a brain apart from a male to a female to roughly 95% of probability, or of all cases. So we can identify real spectrum of different patterns between the sexes. And I'm gonna wrap it up very quickly because I'm already late, but I think it's obvious that the next question that comes into mind is, okay, we are finding out there are differences between the brains of males and females in a complex pattern. So how are these differences really connected to the differences we see in humans in general and to the disorders I mentioned before? So we are still far to answer to this question, and there is a fairly simple explanation for this. Well, the first one is that we still don't understand fully brain and how brain leads to your final output in case the behavior. But also importantly, most of the studies where you really study the mechanism behind the process and the mechanism how a specific region starts to malfunction and lead to a disorder, they usually rely on studies done in the lab that relies on animal studies and cell studies. And when we look into all these sex differences that I mentioned that they come from human studies in the field of neuroscience, we can understand that all these differences come out because we have been studying males and females and comparing them to a very big extent, almost 80% of all cases. And when we look into, for example, animal research, again, neuroscience here, the number of studies where males and females are used, here represented in purple, is very, very limited. So around 25% of all cases. And even the case when we do look at both sexes, sex is often not analyzed, not taken in consideration. So animals are just, or cells, just put all together without taking consideration if one was male and one was female. There are complex reasons why this happened and has been happening so far. Just to kind of summing them up briefly, mostly because, as I mentioned before as well, up to now, there's always been the assumption that the brain is a very robust organ and differences between the sexes were either small or absent. Also, females have been often ignored in research because of the misconception that females for animals, but also cells, were more variable. And since the females go through a cycle, they were more susceptible to changes that were unpredictable. This is changing. These misconceptions have now been kind of left behind, and everything is changing since when in 2015, the NIH, the biggest, introduced as compulsory to receive money to introduce sex as a biological variable in research, which means that nowadays, and this is going to be the future of the research, when studying something in actually every organ, so I'm going to focus in brain now, you are asked to consider, collect, characterize, and communicate sex throughout these phases, or better, take in consideration sex when you consider your design of the experiment, collect the data, characterize the data, and communicate the results. So this is exactly where we are heading now, with the idea to finally discover the real meaning of these sex differences, with the ultimate goal to understand the differences in the disorders, to improve the diagnosis, and improve the treatment and drugs of the disorders. And I want just to finish on a final note, because I felt was important to say, people say that the brain of males and females must be the same, must be equal because we are equal individuals. And this is the way they've been treated brain research so far, with the idea that one was the mirror of the other, and therefore we are now equal analyzing the factor. However, the truth is, when we put the mirror on the male brains and ignore the female brains, what we are doing is actually giving more value to the male and neglecting the fact that females might be different. What we are doing in the field now is bring back the female brain in the picture, not to say that one is better than the other because different, but actually to put them on the same level trying to understand these differences, what they really mean, and in general, our knowledge of the brain. And with this, I would like to finish, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. And yes, I would stop sharing if you're okay, Victoria.
Yes, great. Thanks a lot. Yeah, thank you for those who put the nice smiley on top. If you know how to do that, like reactions, you're welcome to do this. I'm sure Elena will be happy to see. Before we go into Q&A, yay, there are more of those. Just do a little bit of housekeeping, and meanwhile you formulate the questions you want to ask. So just to tell you a bit what's coming, you know what already happened. I introduced 15x4 to you, and we talked about sex differences in the brain, or we listened to Elena talk. Now we will all join the conversation, because now it's time for Q&A session. And afterwards, we also, I hope you hear me fine, actually. Are you hearing me fine? Can someone show me a sign if it's okay? There are some already questions in the chat. Cool. So we will have a networking session. That's one more thing I wanted to tell you. So don't run away after the questions. If you are curious to see who are all other interesting people who joined us today, we will do something very special for you. So to make sure that we ask questions in a bit more organized way, please keep your microphone still off until the moment we call you in, but keep your video on. We are happy to see your faces. And when you want to ask a question, go on to raise hand, and this can be nicely done in Zoom. So if you go to participants or 𝗤𝗿𝗺 or whatever the languages you're using, you open this, then you will see an option to raise hand, and I will be able to see that you rose the hand, and then I will call you, and then you can switch on the microphone and ask questions out loud. Or you can just type them in the chat if you're not really in the mood to say things out loud. And also for people watching us on stream, please keep posting questions in our chats next to the Facebook video, next to the YouTube video, because they all will be sent to me, and I will be able to ask them as well. So the chat I already showed you, and this I kind of speak faster than I change slides, but you got the gist. So chats are there next to the videos. And yeah, actually, before we go finally to the questions, one last thing I wanted to tell you. Now it's pretty hard time for everyone, but also for 15x4, because it is more demanding for us to have the online events, to make sure we pay for all the services that enable us to have the events online and to stream them and to have a proper quality. At the same time, many companies are struggling, and we have much less support than we managed to have before. So if you like our 15x4 events, if you want us to do more nice events, please support us in our crowdfunding campaign. You can either go to GoFundMe and just Google or search there for 15x4, and you will find our campaign, or you can use this short link bit.ly/help15x4. And already here a shout out to all those who already helped us. Thank you guys so much for your support. This is very, very valuable for us, and it helps us keep doing what we do and keep trying to make it even better to you, so that we all exchange knowledge and have this great space for sharing knowledge. And now I stop sharing and I go back to see you all. Would be happy to see more faces. Please don't be shy, switch on your cameras, and you can raise your hands if you have a question ready. And meanwhile, I will read the question from the chat that came from our live stream. So 𝗤𝗿𝗺26 asks, are there findings whether these differences are likely developing during prenatal or in childhood, or shaped by social environment? So Elena, can you comment how are these differences in the brain are formed?
So most of these studies have been done in adults. There are a couple of studies that start from children and then multiple time points. So maybe children, young adults, and adults. For sure, differences does start also in children. So also children start to show differences. The masculinization of the brain happens in utero, so before being born. And we are not really able, however, to really tell apart which of these different come because of the hormones and which one become because of the social environment. Because in humans, they are tightly connected to each other. We cannot really take a human that never had hormones. And also you cannot really hormones in humans. You can do it, so often they do it with women under pills or under hormonal treatments, but it's way more limited. So trying to disentangle these differences using animals, because it gives you these advantages and coming with the limitation, of course, that they're animals and non-humans.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, I thought also probably animals help us a bit, and it's good that we can look at animals on like very different evolutionary stages, so to say, and compare and see what is also conservative between different animals, between different species. Okay, there are more questions. So, oh, there are quite many. Okay. Steph is asking, where does 95% correct identifying of a gender based on brain come from? Some studies said the opposite, wondering whether this is an updated research. So can you share what was this research that you presented?
Yeah, so there's been quite some controversy. But yeah, there were some confusion about this, some controversies about these data. The 95%, now I'm not exactly sure it was 95.0, but it was around 95, comes from 3 or 4 papers that have been published in the last year or so, where they took all previously published data, so they are meta-analysis, and they were actually produced in order to clarify what this confusion there was been in the field, where people were saying there are no differences whatsoever, which was extreme from one side. So I'm happy to share with you, if you want, this new version of the papers. The field had some controversy, meaning not everybody was convinced, but right now everybody kind of agrees that this is the real situation. Cannot tell you that it's exactly 95%. This is, of course, very much depending on the study itself, but it's a very high percentage, like security. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I will share with you.
Very interesting. Yeah, I think would be good if you tell, and like we did always do after this chit-chat sessions, we publish additional materials on our Facebook, so you will find it there. I see Alexei has a question. So Alexei, you can turn on microphone and ask.
Hi there. First of all, thank you for the wonderful presentation. Sorry I don't have my camera on all the time. I'm actually cooking dinner on the side. 2 questions. First, from the purely from a perspective of evolutionary biology, were there any studies into how these differences came into being? Because seeing as how you mentioned different types of connection, for example, associated with motor skills with males, and let's say more task of recognizing faces, emotional recognition in females, it kind of seems to indicate that there were certain, let's say, biological roles that were filled out in our earliest types of development, for example, child rearing, social cohesion for females, and then hunting, gathering, and murdering of particular ape tribes in the male. Is there any work on that showing if there was any connection, or is it just a coincidence?
So I'm not an evolution biologist, so I'm not super informed on kind of evolutionary take of these differences. For sure, the current idea in the field, and indeed these differences might have come from evolutionary advantage for women or men to actually develop a different behavior. I'm not entirely sure, for example, if this is shared, to which extent is shared. I can tell you that there are recent studies that, because I'm more a molecular biologist, on the molecular differences and between the sexes are and partially are unique to humans. So yes, briefly, yes, the current idea is this is because gave an evolutionary advantage to the two sexes to differentiate their function, but I'm not 100% sure what's the current more advanced research.
And if I check the second time on the topic of, let's say, a more molecular analysis of these differences, you mentioned there are studies that, for example, look at women who get hormonal treatments. Are there, for example, also studies for people who transition? Let's say if they transition from male to female or female to male. Can the actual change in hormonal levels, and I would assume that the change in hormonal levels would also affect
would you
behavior?
mind repeating? Because
Elena, I think there is a bit of problem with your connection.
Is my connection
yeah,
problem?
can you check
Oh,
something? Maybe there's a way to check, close something, some change from one network to another.
Let's see.
Meanwhile, I was already asked in the private chat, and if you guys are curious, if you want to be a speaker at one of the next events, you are very welcome to let us know. I will just now write our email in the chat. It's munich@15x4.org, so pretty easy. Oops, I of course send it to the private chat again. This is the tricky part in Zoom. So now to everyone, if you have a topic that you want to share, so we usually have topics on science and technology, humanities also science, not only natural sciences. So if you have a topic you want to talk about, feel free to write us an email, who you are, what you want to talk about, what is your expertise on this topic. And don't be scared, we invite not only scientists, but actually all kinds of people who have knowledge that they want to share and who have expertise in the topic they talk about. So Elena, let's try. Alexei, do you want to try repeating your question?
Yes,
yeah.
You mentioned that there are studies done on, for example, people who receive hormonal treatments to see how changes in hormonal levels can actually affect the behavior or maybe even the structure of the brain, or at least, let's say, the expression of different factors, or maybe even interconnectivity in the brain. I was wondering if there were any studies made where participants were not just male or female, but people who are actually transitioning or in the process of transitioning, let's say from female to male or from male to female, and if there were any changes or any significant changes observed when that happens.
So this is an interesting topic. Let's say that studies that go into the gender aspect, they kind of stay on its own field. So I'm not really aware, like I don't really follow much on gender studies. I'm not entirely sure if more so detailed studies exist, but for sure the hormones itself do shape how the brain responds to the environment and how it activates. So my expectation that would be there might be something happening there, but depends a lot on the time frame, when it happens, how adult is the person, and so on and so forth.
Thanks, Alexei. Sorry that we not always have the exact answer, but I hope that was a bit helpful. Maybe also if Elena finds some additional sources that she is able to share, this we will try. I see a question, the reason hand from Lady. I will use a short name of you, but yeah. let me first take one question from our stream. So here's a question from 𝗤𝗿cie𝗴𝗿𝗺. Are there also known differences in prevalence in Alzheimer's disease and other kind of diseases, for example, in animals between the sexes? Now, I guess it's diseases in animals. Is it known that some diseases are differently represented in animals?
So I can tell you that the studies that are actually looking into sex differences in these disorders in animals are really studies that are coming out in the last 2 years. So the NIH 2015, so kind of from that point, many people started to do that. Before, they were not really looking at that. So most of the time when you work with animals, they're usually male animals. I would need to double check if exactly Alzheimer. So you have Alzheimer models in animals have been already extensively investigated. I would say probably some of the differences will be maintained, as for other disorders I'm aware of, they are maintained. So for example, depression like model anxiety systems, or also ML. So myelinating disorders are indeed reproducing a sex difference in the animals. I'm not exactly sure to which extent is for Alzheimer's disorders.
For Alzheimer's, I can maybe comment as a person who had did a PhD in Alzheimer's in mice. It depends on the exact model. There are different mouse mouse lines that transgenic that model Alzheimer's disease, and some of them have a bit more pronounced differences in the pathology, and others look pretty the same for both sexes. But what I would also be very cautious about is realizing that the way we model Alzheimer's is pretty far from how Alzheimer's develops in humans. This is a big problem for specifically this disease and some other diseases like that are often developed in humans with age. We don't really know what are triggers for these diseases, so it's really hard to model them. And often we model them with transgenic mice, and this is not the same as why people get sick, let's say. So it's a bit tricky here to assess how important these sex differences in mouse model would be and how much it reflects what happens in humans, for example.
I think that's a very good point. I think it applies to many models of like mouse or rats or other systems that are used for studying brain disorders. We are often limited because we don't really know why this disorder actually starts. So we try to reproduce some aspect that we know can be a trigger or not. So we are always reproducing just one small part that might be sex independent in that case. Yeah.
Well, I think what is also interesting here, though, is that we know for other diseases, not only brain connected, but the visceral organs diseases, sometimes there is a big difference in how males and females are affected. I don't know if it's true also for infectious diseases, but I guess that sometimes can also be true. And I think it's, I guess it's not very well studied yet, but probably this is something else that will be investigated in animals, like natural animal diseases. Are they affecting differently male and female animals?
Yeah, that's an important point. Correct. Like, completely agree. Yeah.
Cool. So, lady, please go on to ask your question.
Yeah, thank you, Viktoria, and also thank you, Elena, for the great presentation. I changed my question from the chat to a more provocative question. So the idea is that there are a lot of women. Most of the entrepreneurs are men, and usually people that are in management positions are men. So the question is, do you think that brain differences can explain it, why women are not that representative in this field, or it's just part of the social structure? Which are your thoughts about it?
Did you talk with 𝗍𝗍 recently? Because so I guess when we look into differences in a type of job, there are many factors that go beyond biology. There is definitely bias in hiring and support and sex bias in that point of view. From a biological point of view, we cannot really tell yet how these differences actually end up to impact on how a woman or a man behaves. So we have no idea if your hippocampus is bigger doesn't mean that your hippocampus is better. No, we don't know. We know it's different. So these differences might be behind maybe different aptitude of the two sexes, maybe, but we don't really know. And I would be very, very careful to say that because the two systems are different, I'm talking about system because it's the whole body, not only the brain, it means that one is better at something and better at something else. They might have just two different strategies to get to the final goal. So I would definitely say that right now the big differences in societal positions comes from more the society than the biology itself. That's my opinion, though.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, I got a bit confused with my Zoom interface. Yeah, thanks a lot for answering, Elena. And there is another question from the chat that I just want to say out loud. It says, from your research, which I guess is not your, but still, from your research, is there a connection between brain development according to the sexes and the sexual orientation spectrum or gender spectrum? I know this is not your research per se, but commenting on a more general field knowledge.
Yeah, so again, as I was mentioning before to Alexei, I don't feel too comfortable talking about gender, as I'm not an expert in the field, and I would like to avoid saying something wrong. As I was mentioning before, there is definitely studies that are now trying to explore better where gender come from. Like, is there something biologically encoding gender or something more societal, so environment factors? This research is very, very new though. So even if I was really an expert of the field, I wouldn't feel confident on saying that's what we know. We are really in the phase where we are exploring and we are finding out some things, and then we are finding out the opposite of some things. We are trying to understand what's the truth and where it lies, and everything is more complex than we thought before.
Makes sense. So I'm checking if there are more questions. So I think we answered the questions from the chat. Evgeny, please let me know if you see any more questions in our Facebook or YouTube chat. If not, then also let me know that I know we are done with those. And before we are waiting, or while we're waiting, Elena, tell us about a bit what your research. So I know you research something which is, again, connected to sex differences in the brain. So what exactly it is?
So my study is focusing on sex differences, specifically in depression, or better, I use animal models, I use mice, so we cannot really study depression in mice. We more study the triggers that lead to depression, which is, in case of depression, is generally stress and the stress system. We know that stress is kind of regulated at the level of the brain, and males and females have been shown to be different susceptible to stress. And this is something that can be seen at the biological level, where if I give you the same stress, females have a higher response, they have higher cortical production, but we don't really know why this is happening. So I'm studying the center of the brain that activate the stress response in males and females, trying to study the molecular level, which cell types are behind these differences, and if they might be behind why a female then is going to be more susceptible to stress and later on to depression than a male. The final goal, as I was mentioning, is of course identify molecules that might be becoming new drug targets or new ways to treat in a better way these disorders still don't have a cure.
Cool. So what is already known? Maybe from your study or from some previous studies?
So as I was mentioning, depression is has quite some clinical evidence that show that females are more susceptible to stress and have these more passive symptoms that are the one we usually use to categorize depression. But whereas males, for example, are more prone to have suicide outcomes from depression. So from the molecular point of view, there've been, let's say, a couple of studies, not much more, using human brain tissue, which is a very rare tissue and very precious, let's say, but comes with the complication that you have to collect the brain from a suicide victim that went through suicide, and you collect the brain after some times. So what we're doing, what this field is doing, is trying to understand at the level of molecules, are these patients that died by suicide, because we're talking now by suicide more than depression, different from the ones that are actually females. There is this studies that was published 2 years ago, very, very nice and important in the field, where they indeed were able to see that at the level of molecules, the two systems have different type of molecules expressed, and some of them are also present in the mouse. So they found something in the human brain, and then they tried to change it in the mouse brain and were able to lead to depression like in only males or only females. So this is the road we are taking, identify these molecules specifically for one or the other so that we can increase our chance of cure these people, where right now we have like efficiency of like 50% or so, 60%, where we can actually treat them. So this is kind of where the field is going, and where what we know right now, these differences start from stress response in general, but also the level of molecules, we see differences. And it seems like that these differences might end up to similar outcome at the level of the whole brain. That's why you have kind of the same disorder or similar disorders, but start from something different.
There is actually a question that just came right now, very connected. Are currently males and females, or men and women, treated differently for depression or for any other psychiatric disorders? Are there any protocols for this?
I'm not a doctor, so again, this is from like research point of view. Let's say that when we talk about mental disorder and depression, we also have a higher level of problem with these disorders. Is we are trying to treat them, but we are not really recognizing them properly. And so mental disorder now thought as a spectrum. So you rarely have one disorder, you generally have a bunch of them. So the treatment comes from the combination of these disorders. So I would say that right now, I think the priority when giving a treatment is more looking at the combination of these disorders than really the sex, because also this evidence of what is working better and what is working worse in the sex is still pretty new. So it still always takes some time to go from research to clinic, because you always need to be a little bit cautious, because you don't want to do something too soon and then kind of regret it later on. If this answered the question.
Thanks. I guess it answered the question. Carol, do you want to ask your question out loud?
Yeah, sorry, I'm not able to turn on my camera because my Wi-Fi is actually pretty unstable. I'm just really curious, because you talk about symptoms of depression, causes of depression, and suicidal that present differences in male and females. Just curious if you have done any researches, or are there any existing researches on the recovery process from depression? So are there differences in the brain for male and females when it comes to recovering from depression or being treated for depression?
That's definitely an interesting point of view, an interesting point. From the molecular point of view, we cannot really study the people that actually go better because we don't have access to their brain. So kind of the only brains we really have access from the molecular point of view is post-mortem. So after they died, so they generally are suicide victims. What we can do is study kind of the alteration that are shown at the level of brain activations or symptoms. And I'm not really sure if there are differences in kind of the getting better phase of the pathology. Right now, on top of my head, I'm not entirely sure. There are differences in the development of the disorder, like how fast it is and how severe it becomes, but I cannot think of any studies doing it on like the better curve of it. There are differences in response of drugs, but I don't know if there are like follow-up on that. I'm not sure. I haven't come across any of those.
Thanks. There's, I was smiling while you were talking because there was already intense discussion in the chat, how you stressed out the mouse to do the research. And the second question is if there are any in vitro models for this kind of research.
So you are very welcome to go on the 15x4 Munich YouTube channel and watch my video. But I know you're gonna always be happy to people coming on the channel, so I'm gonna do advertising.
Thanks.
But so there are different ways to stress the mice, either in acute version, so something quick, or in a chronic version, so repeated across days. And this is what we use to kind of generate depression-like phenotype. I can give you some example if you want. As acute, usually you restrain the animal so they cannot move. That's of course a stress for the mouse. From a chronic point of view, what is often used is called chronic social defeat, where the mice are put in the presence of a big bully mouse that protects his own territory. So as a result, he attacks your experimental mouse, and then you rescue the mouse. So it's kind of a repeated defeat of the experimental mouse that they thought to resemble what bullying can be in humans. But there are many different protocols. Another one is to expose the animals to very mild stressor. For example, you just mess up with their cage once a day or twice a day for multiple days. So there are different types. Some works better than others. But for example, just because we're talking about sex differences, the chronic social defeat I mentioned is one of the most used. It's like the most used in the field, and that one worked on in males, and there's never been a problem so far because people didn't really care so much. So now that we are trying to introduce also systems and stress models that work in both sexes. And regarding the in vitro models for research, so this is again another field that is now moving into look at sex differences. So far, not much has been done. There are few studies where sex differences was the question, so they managed to generate cells, either males or females, and then you can do it using mouse cells or human cells, and then going into the organoids and assembloids. Often when doing these in vitro studies from humans, what you do often is also using cells from patients that you reprogram, you change so that they become neuron cells. And in that case, you are aware of which sex you are analyzing. There are also then complications. If the more variable you want to explore, means you need to have more cells and more systems. And for some of these in vitro systems, it's not really feasible yet to have mass production of them. So let's say that the direction is that one. They are starting to explore sex also in vitro. It's not routine yet.
Thanks. Alessandro has a question, I guess.
Yes, thank you. Ele, do you think that sex differences in the brain are going to be reinforced if you keep females only with females and males together with males, or if you instead like have a mixed environment?
That's a fascinating question. I would say that if you mix the environment, you're gonna definitely activate all those sexually dimorphic systems that are connected to reproduction. So many of these differences have been associated to, especially in the deep part of the brains, to reproduction things like lactation and pregnancy, for example, especially in females. So for sure, I guess that those systems might not be activated so much if you never experience reproduction, anything connected to reproduction. But I wouldn't expect the sex differences to be dependent on the sex of who we are interacting with. So I don't really know. I don't even think somebody is actually looking into this. For sure, social experience change your brain and like how you relate to the world. but I would be a wild guess mine, so I don't really know.
Thanks, Elena. Thanks, Alessandro, for a very interesting question. So Alessandro is going to be our speaker actually in a month, in August. He will also talk about some interesting neuroscience topics. So sign up to our page and you will be notified. Also, thanks, Alexei, for sharing a link about study on differences in brain structures for transgender youth and adults. I guess for some of you that might be interesting to look at. With this, I would suggest that we move on to our next part of the evening before everyone is too tired. For this, I will first share a screen for a bit again. If you are now more inclined to help us, just to remind you that we have this crowdfunding campaign ongoing. And what is also important is that we are having an offline event on Saturday. I'm actually super excited because it's been now, oh my God, it's actually been half a year almost since we had the last event. This last event we had offline was in February, and it was really difficult for us to not do offline events, to not meet our guests. So we're super happy that Deutsches Museum invited us to be part of their summer stage. So for those in Munich, please mark your calendar this Saturday. We start at 1. We will have 4 talks on different topics, as we always do at our regular offline events. Please come. We will be super happy to see you there. And now we will go into networking session. So what exactly will happen is that we will use the super feature of breakout rooms in Zoom. And you need to give me a couple seconds to make it work. And you will be in a group with, let's see how many of us. So 2-3 people. And I invite you to just get to know each other and exchange your thoughts on what you just learned, what was interesting, what was unusual. And I see that some people are leaving, which is completely fine. We have, by the way, stopped the streaming, I guess, right, Nina? Great. So thanks all those who watched us.